Do you really know what your wholesale margin is? We're going to give you a little bit to think about here. Hi everybody, welcome to the DCSI Parts Guys. We're brought to you by Dealership CSI. We're powered by ESPM. Today we're going to talk about part 2 of the myth of the 40% margin. I'm Rick. There's Jerry. Good morning, Jerry. How you doing?
Good morning, Rick. I'm doing real good. I'm looking forward to this episode. We've got quite a bit to share with everybody regarding the 40% margin, and different manufacturers approach that a little bit different way. So we're going to show some of those differences and give you a lot of good information. So take notes if you want.
It's a good idea, Jer. Take a few notes, keep everything organized, because we got a lot to talk about today. Jer, I recommend you buckle up, because this is going to blow your socks off when we start talking about the margin differences between manufacturers and how this whole thing has evolved from what used to be a pretty cut and dry situation. So let's start with looking at the first realization that we had as a company, that there's some real funny stuff going on with margins. We have a genius on our staff, a guy named Jack, lives out in the hills in Pennsylvania. And he does all of the data processing for all of our clients. Every single month, Jack probably gets somewhere around 500-600 different files of data, works with it, comes up with the reporting and the analysis that we're looking at. And we just kind of go through all this, and all of a sudden one day, Jack sends me this file and says, hey, look at this margin column that's over on the right here. And I took a look at that and I said, wow, where's the 40%? Conspicuously absent, that's for sure. Back in the old days, I talked to a dealer principal a long time ago after he got his first franchise, and we were talking about parts and margins, and he said, well, the manufacturer said everything I buy from them will have a 40% margin, and we're good to go. And so we kind of shook hands on that, put the deal together, and we've been rolling along ever since. Well, things kind of changed along the way, and the first change that we ever saw back in the old days was the asterisk. Jer, you ever see an asterisk?
Well, Rick, that was back in the old price books, and again, that was certain manufacturers that provided that information. But what the asterisk was supposed to tell you is that you didn't have a full 40% margin on those parts. A lot of times it would be major assemblies, maybe some remanufactured items, things like that. And like I said, the asterisk there just said, hey, these don't carry a 40% margin, so just be a little bit cautious if you're discounting things like that. It can affect a lot of your own gross profit margins when we start discounting.
That was a nice little tool to have to kind of give us a heads up. And I remember doing some wholesale business, and you'd come across one of those asterisk parts, and first thing you'd do is look at your cost, figure out your margin, and then you'd make a deal with your wholesale guy. I can't give you full discount on this one because I'm not making full margin. And we'd come to an agreement and move down the road. But with computers now, asterisks are gone. We have no idea what's going on. And as you'll see in a second here, the manufacturers have made a move in a big way in the margins that they provide us, and they're constantly changing. So with that information that Jack gave us, it led us to create the manufacturer margin chart. And we've got a manufacturer's margin review I want to go over with you real quick. Jared, this is the chart as it stands, first pass, sorted by dealerships in no particular order here. But what we did with this chart is we took a variety of our clients, and everybody on this list had an inventory of $400,000 to $600,000, so a fairly good sized store. every part number that we looked at least one demand in the last year. So it's parts they sold. It's not just parts we pulled out of the price book. And then we started to do some math on the ratio of greater than 40% margin, 40%, and under 40%. And the way we did it, if it was a tenth of a percentage point over 40, it got in the over 40. If it was a tenth of a percent under, it got in the under, and so on. But as you can see from our original chart, it's all over the map here. And so once we put it all together, what kind of story you think this tells, Jer?
Well, if you take a look at the manufacturer margin review, you'll see that, we talked about that 40%. We're talking about the myth of the 40% margin. Well, there's very few parts really, even across the board. The only one that has at least 50% of their parts at a 40% margin is Audi. Everybody else is below that, and some very way below that. So it kind of varies all over the board, and it makes you aware that you need to look and see what kind of margin you're getting from the manufacturer. If you're going to be selling at MSRP, which is manufacturer suggested retail price, it sure helps to know what kind of a margin you're achieving. And like I said, it really points out the obvious. The margins are all over the board, so they're really different depending upon the type of part, depending upon a lot of different things, but those things are out of your control, and the manufacturer's already dictating that.
So, Jer, let's sort these out and start with looking at anything greater than a 40% margin. What do you see on the top of the list on that one, Jer?
Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting when we start sorting these out. You see at the top there, Mazda, they've got almost 77% of their part numbers carry greater than a 40% margin. Only a little bit below 9% at a 40% margin, and only 14% below 40. So if I'm looking for something greater than 40%, obviously I'm looking towards the top here, seeing Mazda, Mercedes, Dodge, Nissan, GM. Ford comes in at 43.85, so not too bad. But it really starts dropping down. You get to the bottom of that list, and you look at Land Rover, and there's only 15% of the parts that really have anything greater than a 40% margin. So that's one way to look at it. We've got another way to look at it. We broke it down by who's exactly at that 40% margin. And I think we should take a look at that tab now, Rick.
So if you look at 40%, this was the kind of promise back in the old days that my buddy was telling me about. And you can see what happened to the promise here. The highest percentage on the board of these dealers we're showing is Audi at 50%. So half of the parts that you sell in an Audi store are going to have 40% margin right on the nose. If you happen to be in a Porsche store, however, down on the bottom, 0.34 of everything you sell has a 40% margin. So it's way across the board here. Nobody is following suit. Everything varies according to some weird formulas the manufacturers come up with, and we're not sure where that comes from. And then we have the less than 40, Jer.
Yeah, when you take a look at the less than 40%, that's where I get a little bit scared. If I'm a manufacturer for Land Rover or a dealer for Land Rover, I've only got 15% of my part numbers greater than 40. I got 6% at 40, and then I got 79% of the part numbers are carrying less than a 40% margin. They're not alone, really. You look at Porsche. Porsche's right at 71%. BMW's at 70%. So it just points out that there's a lot of your parts that don't carry that promised, a long time ago, promised 40% margin. So you really need to be aware. Obviously, if I've got greater than 40% and a 40%, you might want to take a look at combining those two numbers and see what that gives you. If you really look at it, you look at Audi and you look at their greater than 40%, they're at 29%, greater than 40%, and 50% at 40%. So almost 80% of the part numbers are at 40 or above. That's not too bad. The scary part is that under 40% column, and that's where it really gets ugly, especially in those top three.
So you might be looking at that chart and saying, well, wait a minute, I'm a Toyota dealer and I don't see you on the chart. I'm a Honda dealer, I don't see it on the chart. We didn't want to list every manufacturer, but what we do want to do is give you an opportunity to look at your individual store, look at the performance of your manufacturer. So if you're interested in getting an analysis like this on your exact parts that you're selling, on your exact manufacturer, drop us an email. We're at the DCSI Parts Guys at gmail.com. Drop us an email and we'll be glad to put together a little analysis for you and send it back so you know exactly where you stand on the margins and what you can do about it. So Jer, we're looking at margins and we're talking about the impact it has on our store. And the biggest impact that I think we're going to experience here is in our wholesale department. A lot of the people listening to us right now have big wholesale departments, and it's always a struggle to kind of keep the margins up. It's always a struggle to be competitive in the marketplace and to gain as much business as we can. But let's walk through a couple of examples of discounting and see what this crazy manufacturer margin variance does to our wholesale pricing. So for starters, Jer, look at the 25% discount at 40%.
Well, Rick, what we've got here is we've got a BMW part number, not picking on any one manufacturer. It's just that we pulled that up out of the database. And this is a typical part here. It's called a lock assembly. It's got a 40% margin from the manufacturer. So in other words, if we sold it at MSRP, list price, $313.97, our cost on it's $188.38. So selling it at MSRP would yield you a gross profit of $125.59 for a 40% margin. Like you said, there's a lot of clients out there. They're in the wholesale business. We all do some kind of wholesale. The imports generally had a little bit better a long time ago. There was less competition. That competition's picking up. So back in the day, you know, we used to give 15% discount, sometimes a 20% discount to a good client. We're seeing a lot of 25% discounts to wholesale clients in the marketplace nowadays. So if we take this particular part and we discount it 25% to our wholesaler, we end up selling it for $235.48. That gives us gross profit left of $47.10, which is a 20% margin. Now that 25% discount to your wholesale client is going to give him a selling price or a cost to him of $235.48, and he's either going to sell it at that MSRP or he might even mark it up further. But even at the MSRP of $313.97, he gets himself a gross profit of $78.49, which is really a 25% margin. And you'll see that across the board. When we're giving that 25% discount, the client's really getting a 25% margin. So in this case, his margin's better than ours. Okay, typical part, 40% margin. That 25% off is putting the profit structure really in the client's favor.
So Jer, if I'm at a 25% discount going in on virtually all of my business, some guys I've heard are going 30s, 32s, even some 35s if they get way out there. And that's on a 40% margin part. So I'm still getting the wrong end of the deal. What happens if we're on a lesser margin part? Let's say we're looking at a 32% margin, 25% discount. And again, we're looking at BMW parts. We just happen to pull up a few of those. It could apply to any part because we're talking about margins here and not part numbers or manufacturers. So this particular part has a cost of $132, a list of $194.72 with a $62 gross profit. That's my 32% margin. So I'm happily discounting along and I come up with a new selling price of $146. I give my wholesale guy the $146 price. I'm making 13, he's making 48, I'm making 9, he's making 25. How does that work, Jer?
Well, it works pretty good for that wholesale guy. He's still getting, like I said, he's getting his 25% margin, so there's really no problem. Rick, I don't see a problem. Do you see a problem?
I don't see a problem unless I'm the dealer principal or maybe an astute parts manager that figures out, wait a minute, I've got my wholesale business that requires the highest paid counter guys on the phone. Those wholesale guys demand that. Of course, I've got to have delivery. I've got to have a truck, gas, and staff to man that. I've got to hold some extra inventory for this business. And for a lot of these guys, I'm offering a no interest, no collateral loan with uncertain terms just to sell them these parts. Oh, and by the way, I've got an open return policy. So my obsolescence could be at stake here but I'm making 9%, so I'm happy. So Jer, what happens if it's even under 32%? Let's take a look at, go
You've
ahead.
been generous already, Rick, but we'll take a look at a part because there are a lot of parts that don't even have that 32% margin. So we've got another example here, and it's a tensioner spring. Cost on it's $29.34. MSRP, list price $39.65. Gives us a gross profit of $10.31, a 26% margin if we're selling it retail, if we're selling it MSRP. We've got our wholesale client. We're still promising them that 25% discount. So when we discount it to the wholesale customer, he ends up paying $29.74 because we gave him that 25% off of the $39.65. Well, in this case, Rick, we're down to 40 cents gross profit, 1% margin. Client, he's still at his 25% margin because that's what we gave him, a 25% discount, and he's going to make $9.91 for his 25% margin. So in this case, a lot of effort for 40 cents profit.
Jerry, you think they ever reviewed those transactions in the monthly managers meeting?
Well, what they do review is your margin that you're making on that segment of the category, whether it be wholesale sales, retail sales. The general manager, dealer principal, they're always looking at the financial statement. And right on that financial statement, one of the biggest things they look at is that gross profit margin. They look at it for just about every category, and there are guidelines and there are benchmarks for every category. And obviously, if we're selling too much at this 1% margin, we're not going to come anywhere near those benchmarks.
Well, and I don't know if anybody in the dealership, parts manager included, would feel good about a 1% transaction, but they happen all the time as we're looking, and that's why this margin review and the manufacturer margin is so important to see and understand and realize how it impacts your own business. Now, Jerry, we've got a couple of different things that we can help dealers with to overcome that low margin. What do you think we should talk about in that respect?
Well, Rick, there's numerous tools that you can use out there. We've got quite a few. We've been using price matrixing in some stores, and a price matrix will help overcome some of that. Obviously, a pricing strategy goes hand in hand with that. If you're into the wholesale market, you have to have some kind of a strategy. Maybe 25% across the board is not the way to go. Maybe it's a cost plus basis. There's different strategies that can be employed. Numerous strategies, and I think we should get into a little bit of that in some future episodes here on the DCSI Parts Guys.
Good plan, Jer. I think we're going to cover the matrix in one of the upcoming episodes, what the matrix is all about, how to build a matrix, and we'll show you how to get into the matrix screens on your various systems, ADP, rentals, and DealerTrack. And then the second part is each one of those systems has a pretty cool gross profit margin safety net program built in so that you can set a threshold on your gross profit and it will either alert you or reprice your ticket if you happen to go below that. So there are some things, and we're going to show you some of that stuff in parts 3 and 4 of the myth of the 40% margin. So I want to thank everybody for joining us here. I hope you enjoyed it and got a little bit of something out of it. Please subscribe to our channel, share it with anybody you know, give us some likes down on the bottom, drop a comment or two if you'd like, and stay tuned for the next one. Jer, I want to thank you for stepping in and helping us out today.
Rick, it was my pleasure, and like Rick said, be sure and give us a thumbs up there. Lets us know that we're giving you something that you can make some good use out of. If you got any comments, feel free to forward those to our email address also.
Thanks, Jer, and let's go make some money.